March 1995. San Diego. A man sits alone in a parking lot, waiting for someone he trusts more than almost anyone alive. He's 35 years old. Over the last 15 years, he built one of the largest crack cocaine networks in American history. Prosecutors will later say he moved several tons of it and made more than $500 million doing it. He survived raids, betrayals, a police task force built with his own street name stamped on the file. He knows how to read a room. And right now, this room feels wrong. His supplier never meets in daylight, never leaves his own territory, never wants the money before the product shows up. Today, he's breaking all 3 rules at once. He goes anyway. He tells himself he's not even the one at risk today, just introducing an old friend to a buyer, stepping back once it's done, just showing up. Showing up is about to cost him the rest of his life, because the man waiting for him has already made a different deal. Not with him, with the federal government. Years of quiet cooperation, payments on record. And right now, somewhere close, agents are watching this exact meeting unfold. A meeting they've been building toward for weeks. He still doesn't know any of that. Minutes later, handcuffs, a federal case, a mandatory sentence already sitting in a folder, waiting for a judge to read it out loud. The man who taught him everything, who he calls almost family, wasn't there to sell him cocaine. He was there to sell him. And what this man is about to find out, sitting in a cell over the next few weeks, isn't just that his mentor betrayed him. It's why. A reason that has nothing to do with drugs, and everything to do with a covert war 3,000 miles away, one that the CIA itself would later admit it knew more about than it ever told the public. Okay, before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are right now. I read these, and I want to know who's in this with me tonight. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and tap that like button before we keep going. It genuinely helps this channel. And trust me, you want to see where the story ends up? By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a South Central teenager's rise became tangled with a scandal that reached the CIA, the Reagan White House, and Congress. So stick with me. Let's go back to the beginning. To a kid nobody expected anything from, on a tennis court that should have been his way out. Ricky Danilo Ross was born on January 26, 1960, in the small East Texas town of Troop. He was 3 years old when his mother, Annie Mae Malden, packed up and moved the family west of Los Angeles, settling in South Central, a sprawling, densely packed patchwork of black working-class neighborhoods that, by the 1960s and 70s, had already absorbed waves of families fleeing the Jim Crow South in search of factory jobs, aerospace work, and something that looked like opportunity. They settled in a neighborhood pressed up against the Harbor Freeway, the 110, one of the arteries that cuts Los Angeles into pieces, carrying commuters over and past the neighborhoods beneath it without ever really touching them. That proximity to the freeway would, years later, give Ross the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. But as a child, it was just where he lived, a low-income pocket of the city, raised largely by his mother in a single-parent household, in a part of Los Angeles that the rest of the city tended to drive over rather than through. South Central in this era was not yet synonymous with crack cocaine. That would come later, and Ross would end up at the center of it. In the 1970s, it was synonymous with something else, limited options. Deindustrialization was already beginning to hollow out the manufacturing jobs that had drawn black families to Los Angeles in the first place. Schools were underfunded and often overcrowded. And for a poor kid with more energy than direction, the paths out tended to run through exactly 2 doors, sports or crime. Ross, like a lot of kids in his neighborhood, walked toward the first door before he ever seriously considered the second. He found tennis, of all sports, almost by accident. According to Ross's own account, he and some neighborhood kids were playing a park one day, engaged in nothing more structured than a game of roller derby, when a local instructor named Richard Williams, not the same Richard Williams who would go on to coach his daughters Venus and Serena into global stardom, but a different man entirely, an LA area tennis coach who spent his time introducing inner city kids to a sport most of them had never touched, offered the group a quarter for anyone who could hit a tennis ball into a box. It didn't hook Ross that instant, but not long after, it did. From there, Ross found his way to Dorsey High School, a South Central institution known, somewhat improbably for a school in one of the poorest parts of the city, for producing legitimate tennis talent. He joined the team. He got good, fast, competitive, with the kind of hunger that coaches love to see in a raw athlete. Ross began to picture a future that looked nothing like the one his neighborhood typically offered. College, on a tennis scholarship, playing a sport that, at the time, still carried an air of aspiration and crossover appeal. He idolized Arthur Ashe, the black tennis star who had broken barriers in a historically white country club sport and turned himself into a symbol that a kid from South Central could actually look up to and see something of himself. Ross wasn't alone in this dream. Around him were other South Central kids doing the same thing, grinding out hours on public courts, hoping tennis could be the door that led somewhere else. Some of them made it out. Ross, for a long stretch of his adolescence, looked like he might be one of them. Then, in his senior year at Dorsey High, that dream ran directly into a wall Ross had spent years quietly working around. He could not read. Ross had been pushed through the Los Angeles school system for over a decade without anyone meaningfully addressing his illiteracy. He has since spoken about this candidly in interviews and in his own memoir, how a kid can move from grade to grade, year after year, functionally invisible to a system that has neither the resources nor, frankly, the will to stop and ask why he can't do the reading. Ross wasn't unintelligent. By every account, from coaches, from later observers of his business operation, from the federal agents who eventually studied his organization, he was sharp, strategic, and quick. But sharp and quick don't fill out a college application. They don't get you through an SAT. And when it came time to translate his tennis talent into a scholarship, the gatekeepers of that system needed him to be able to read and write at a basic level, and he could not. He was told, in his senior year, that his illiteracy made a scholarship essentially impossible. Ross has described the moment as one of the most crushing of his young life. Not just missing an opportunity, but understanding, with sudden clarity, that a door he'd been running toward for years had never actually been open to him in the first place. He wasn't just losing tennis. He was losing the version of his future built around it. He didn't collapse. If anything, according to people who knew him at the time, the humiliation hardened something in him. A determination that the door being shut on tennis wasn't going to be the door being shut on ambition altogether. He dropped out of Dorsey his senior year, and he started looking with the same competitive intensity he'd once put into a tennis match for another way to make it, and to make it big. Ross has said in multiple interviews over the years that he never saw himself working some ordinary minimum wage job. The idea of clocking in at a fast food counter for a fraction of what he believed he was capable of earning simply wasn't on the table for him. Psychologically, he wanted scale. He wanted to be somebody. He just lost a legitimate route to becoming somebody, and he was 17 years old with almost no other tools in the box. What he did have was a head for numbers, a willingness to hustle relentlessly, and a neighborhood already saturated with an underground economy that didn't care whether you could read. Before drugs, there was simpler crime. Ross has spoken about an early period involving car theft, chop shop work, the kind of low-level property crime that a lot of teenagers in his position drifted into almost by default, less a grand plan than the path of least resistance in a neighborhood with few legal alternatives for someone his age with no diploma and no connections. It was money. It kept him afloat. But it wasn't the thing that would define the next 15 years of his life. That would come from a different direction entirely, through an older man Ross has described as a kind of mentor figure, someone he encountered at a job training center in his late teens. According to Ross's own account, this man, a teacher at the center, introduced him to cocaine, not as a user but as a business proposition. Ross, around 19 years old at the time, looked up to him. He began selling small amounts of powder cocaine on his behalf. The money, even at that modest scale, was better than anything he'd made stealing cars. Before long, Ross had gone from working for this man to working the trade on his own. It is worth pausing here on something the story of Ricky Ross makes uncomfortably clear, something that runs underneath the entire arc of what's about to happen to him. None of this occurred because South Central Los Angeles lacked talent, discipline, or ambition. It occurred because a kid with real athletic gifts and a genuinely sharp mind hit an educational system that failed him at the most basic level, in a neighborhood with a shrinking legitimate economy and an expanding illegal one standing right there to absorb him. Ross would go on to build one of the largest cocaine distribution networks in American history, an operation that, by the government's own estimates, would eventually move several tons of product and generate hundreds of millions of dollars. The organizational instincts, the risk calculus, the discipline required to run something at that scale, those were real skills. They just got pointed in the only direction that was actually open to him. By the time he turned 20, the tennis courts of Dorsey High were a memory. Ricky Ross was no longer the promising athlete chasing a scholarship. He was becoming something else. Something South Central didn't have a name for yet, because the drug that would define his career and define an era hadn't fully arrived in Los Angeles when Ross first started selling. He was still moving powder cocaine, still learning the trade, still small, but that was about to change. And the man who would change it, who would hand Ricky Ross not just a bigger supply, but access to a pipeline that stretched quietly and improbably all the way to a covert war in Central America, was about to walk into his life. By the early 1980s, Ricky Ross was moving cocaine on his own, no longer working under the man who'd first introduced him to the trade. He was good at it, methodical, careful, hungry, but he was still operating on a relatively small scale, buying and reselling powder in quantities that made him money, but nowhere near the fortune that would later define him. What Ross needed, if he was going to grow, was a supplier who could move real weight at a price that made large-scale distribution worthwhile. What he found, through a chain of introductions that started almost mundanely with someone asking him to help pick a stranger up from the airport, was a man named Oscar Danilo Blandón. Blandon's own story begins thousands of miles away, in a country most of Ross's customers in South Central couldn't have located on a map, Nicaragua. Born in 1951, Blandón had, according to later government investigations, been connected to Nicaragua's Somoza-era elite before the 1979 Sandinista Revolution swept that government from power and sent waves of Nicaraguans, many of them, like Blandón, from backgrounds tied to the old regime or its business class, fleeing north. Blandón left Nicaragua with his family in June 1979 and made his way to Los Angeles, where in February 1980 he applied for political asylum in the United States. Los Angeles in the early 1980s had a growing community of Nicaraguan exiles, many of them bitterly opposed to the new Sandinista government and hungry for any way to strike back at it. Around 1980 or 1981, Blandón began attending meetings of a Contra support group forming in the city, one of many such informal networks springing up among exiles across the U.S. as opposition to the Sandinistas hardened into something more organized. According to later Justice Department findings, a Contra military leader named Colonel Enrique Bermudez visited Los Angeles around this time, and the loosely organized local support group affiliated itself with his movement, the FDN. The Nicaraguan Democratic Force, one of the primary Contra factions the United States would spend the following decade backing, funding, and arming in an effort to topple the Sandinista government. It was through this world of Nicaraguan exile politics that Blandón crossed paths, in 1982, with a man named Norwin Menezes, a Nicaraguan trafficker, already carrying a serious reputation. Someone people in Nicaragua reportedly referred to as El Padrino, the Godfather. According to Blandon's own later account to government investigators, Menezes approached him with a proposition. Menezes would supply Blandón with cocaine and teach him how to sell it, and the profits would go toward supporting the Contra revolution back home. Blandón, by his own telling, agreed. He later said he felt he had nothing to lose, and that he would do almost anything to get back to Nicaragua someday under a different government. Whatever the original intent behind that arrangement, it didn't stay purely political for long. By 1983, according to government findings, Blandón broke away from working directly for Menezes' cause-driven operation and began selling cocaine independently, for his own profit rather than exclusively for the Contra cause. The war in Nicaragua may have been the door Blandón walked through, but by the time he crossed paths with a young, ambitious South Central dealer named Ricky Ross, he was very much running his own business. That connection, Blandón and Ross, began, according to government timelines, in late 1983 or 1984. Ross has described the moment he first understood what Blandón could offer him. Real weight, at a price that made mass distribution genuinely profitable, sourced through a Colombian supply chain most South Central dealers simply didn't have access to. Ross has said he bought his first kilogram of cocaine from Blandon for around $40,000, a steep price by later standards, but one that, once Ross began working the math of street-level resale, opened up a level of profit he hadn't touched before. The relationship between the two men grew close, at least by Ross's account. He has described spending time at Blandon's home, a world away, both geographically and economically, from the crowded blocks of South Central where Ross did his actual business. Blandon, according to Ross, effectively schooled him in the mechanics of the wholesale cocaine trade, how to move volume, how to manage risk, how to structure a network that could scale. It was, in his own dark way, an apprenticeship, an immigrant with ties to a foreign civil war teaching a poor black teenager from South Central how to build an empire neither of them could have built on their own. And the timing of that apprenticeship mattered enormously, because it coincided almost exactly with the arrival of a new product that was about to change the American drug trade and American cities forever. Crack cocaine, powder cocaine, through the late 1970s and early 80s, had been an expensive, largely upper-middle-class and elite drug, the stuff of Wall Street bathrooms and Hollywood parties, priced well out of reach for most working-class buyers on a regular basis. Crack changed that math completely by converting powder cocaine into a smokable rock form, cooking it down with baking soda and water into small, hardened pellets. Dealers could sell cocaine in tiny, cheap increments, $5, $10, $20 a hit, instead of the $100-plus price point of a gram of powder. It hit faster, harder, and more addictively than powder cocaine when smoked, and it turned a luxury good into something that could be sold on virtually any street corner, to virtually anyone with a few dollars in their pocket. Ross has said in interviews that at the time crack first appeared on the streets of South Central, even the police didn't immediately understand what they were looking at. That officers who searched dealers and found small white rocks in someone's possession often didn't associate them with an illegal narcotic in a way they would have instantly recognized a bag of powder. That gap between a rapidly spreading new product and a law enforcement apparatus that hadn't caught up to it yet created a window. And Ross, sitting on a reliable, high-volume cocaine connection through Blandon, at exactly the moment that window opened, was extraordinarily well positioned to walk through it. He didn't invent crack cocaine. No single person did, and the drug spread through American cities in the early to mid-1980s happened simultaneously and semi-independently in multiple cities, driven by simple economics. A glut of cheap Colombian cocaine flooding into the country created downward pressure on wholesale prices, and dealers everywhere, not just in Los Angeles, began experimenting with cheaper, smokable forms of the drug to move greater volume to a broader customer base. But Ross, more than almost anyone else operating in South Central at the time, understood immediately what the shift meant for his business, and he moved to exploit it with a speed and organizational discipline that would define the rest of the decade. What Blandon supplied, Ross distributed, and distributed at a scale that quickly outstripped what either man had likely imagined when their relationship began. Ross has described the shift in blunt terms. He wasn't just buying a kilogram here and there anymore. He was buying in bulk, cooking it into crack, and pushing it out through a network of street-level sellers that he built, managed, and controlled with the same discipline that, in another life, might have made him a formidable businessman in any legitimate industry. The money changed everything, and it changed it fast. Where Ross's earlier hustling, the car theft, the small-time powder sales, had kept him modestly afloat, the crack trade, powered by Blandon's supply line, began generating money at a scale Ross had never touched before. He has described those early years of the crack boom as intoxicating in their own right, separate from the drug itself. For a young man who had been told by the very system meant to educate him that he had no real future, here was concrete, overwhelming proof otherwise. He was making more money in a week than most people in his neighborhood made in a year. He was, by the metrics that mattered to him at 19, 20, 21 years old, already winning. But there was a cost accumulating just beneath the surface of that success. One Ross, by his own later admission, was slow to fully register. The same product that was making him rich was beginning, block by block, to hollow out the very community he'd grown up in. Crack's cheap price point and intense, fast-acting high made it uniquely destructive as a mass-market street drug, spreading addiction through South Central at a speed that outpaced anything the neighborhood, or the city, or the country had experienced with cocaine before. Ross has said publicly years later, that it took him roughly 5 years into dealing before he began to fully register the damage crack was doing around him. Not because he was oblivious, but because the demand kept climbing regardless, and in the logic of the business he'd built, demand climbing looked, in the moment, like nothing more than opportunity. That tension, enormous individual wealth, built directly on top of a product devastating the community that wealth came from, would sit at the center of Ricky Ross's story for the rest of his life, and would become one of the central, uncomfortable questions underlying everything that came after. The empire, the fall, and the far larger, far stranger story about where exactly the money and the product were actually coming from. Because Danilo Blandón wasn't just a resourceful immigrant with a good cocaine connection. He was, according to his own later testimony to federal investigators, part of a supply chain whose original purpose, however diluted it became over time, was to fund a war. And by the time Ricky Ross had scaled his operation into one of the largest crack distribution networks in Los Angeles, the money flowing back up that same pipeline was, according to an explosive investigation that wouldn't surface for another decade, allegedly helping arm a CIA-backed guerrilla army fighting a government 3,000 miles south of South Central Los Angeles. Ross didn't know any of that yet. In the early to mid-1980s, all he knew was that his business was growing, his money was multiplying, and the man who'd taught him the trade seemed to have an almost bottomless supply of product whenever Ross needed more. He was about to find out just how far that supply chain actually reached. By the mid-1980s, Ricky Ross was no longer a young dealer working a corner or two in South Central. He was, by every account, his own journalist and eventually federal prosecutors, running something closer to a distribution company, a structured, disciplined organization built to move enormous quantities of crack cocaine across Los Angeles and, before long, well beyond it. The scale is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to lose in the abstraction of numbers. Federal prosecutors would later estimate that over the course of Ross's career, he exported several tons of cocaine to cities across the country, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and elsewhere, and generated more than $600 million in the process. Ross himself has claimed his peak earnings ran even higher, describing periods where his organization was clearing as much as $2 to $3 million a day at the height of the crack boom. Whatever the precise figure, and precise figures are inherently elusive in an all-cash, off-the-books criminal enterprise, every source agrees on the basic shape of the story. What started as one South Central teenager buying a single kilogram from Danilo Blandón for $40,000 had, within a few years, become one of the largest street-level narcotics operations in American history. How did a functionally illiterate high school dropout with no formal business training build something at that scale? The answer, consistently, across nearly every account of Ross's operation, from journalists who covered him, to the federal agents who eventually built cases against him, to Ross's own retrospective descriptions of his own methods, comes down to organizational instinct. Ross structured his network the way a legitimate wholesale distributor might. He didn't sell directly to end users on street corners himself. He supplied a tier of sub-dealers, who in turn managed their own networks of street-level sellers, insulating Ross from the riskiest, most visible layer of the operation, while still allowing him to control pricing, quality, and supply across a sprawling territory. He reinvested aggressively, using drug profits to acquire real estate and other assets, a pattern common among successful traffickers of the era, both as a way to launder cash and as a hedge against the inevitable volatility of an illegal business. He also understood, in a way that set him apart from many contemporaries, the value of consistency and reliability as a business proposition. In an industry defined by violence, unpredictability, and constant law enforcement pressure, Ross built a reputation, deserved or not, for running a comparatively disciplined operation, one where supply was steady and business was, in the narrow sense that mattered to his customers and sub-dealers, professional. That reputation, combined with Blandon's seemingly limitless supply line, let Ross's network expand block by block, then neighborhood by neighborhood, across South Central Los Angeles through the early to mid-1980s. The cultural backdrop against which all of this unfolded matters too, because Ross's rise wasn't happening in a vacuum. Early 1980s Los Angeles, and South Central specifically, was a city in transition and not a gentle one. The manufacturing jobs that had drawn earlier generations of black families to the city were disappearing at an accelerating rate as factories closed or relocated. Gang culture, embodied most visibly by the rival Crips and Bloods sets that had been forming and hardening since the late 1960s and 70s, was becoming an increasingly organized and territorial presence in the same neighborhoods where Ross was building his network. And crack, with its need for a dense network of low-level street sellers willing to hold territory, would soon become deeply, sometimes violently, intertwined with that gang infrastructure. Music was shifting too. The West Coast hip-hop scene that would later explode nationally with acts chronicling exactly this world. The money, the violence, the police helicopters, the block-by-block drug economy was still gestating these years, but the raw material it would eventually draw on was being generated in real time, on the same streets where Ross's network was expanding. None of this excuses what was happening, and Ross himself, in later interviews, has not asked for that kind of excuse. But it helps explain why the crack trade, once it took hold in South Central, spread with such devastating speed. It arrived in neighborhoods already experiencing economic abandonment, already home to organized structures, the gangs, capable of absorbing a new, extraordinarily profitable product line, and already largely outside the notice or concern of a broader city and country that, for the first several years of the epidemic, treated what was happening in South Central as a problem, contained to South Central. That containment wouldn't last. And the cost of the crack trade's rapid spread was, by the mid-1980s, becoming impossible to ignore inside the neighborhoods actually living through it, even if the rest of the country, and even Ross himself, in the thick of a rapidly expanding and enormously profitable business, was slower to reckon with it. By 1986, the human cost of what was happening on the streets Ross's network supplied had become undeniable to almost everyone living inside it, even as the operation itself kept growing. Addiction rates in South Central were climbing at a pace no one had modeled for, because nothing quite like crack, cheap, smokable, ferociously fast-acting, had moved through an American city before. Families that had survived the economic collapse of the manufacturing era, that had weathered decades of underinvestment and neglect, were now absorbing a second, faster-moving crisis. Parents disappearing into addiction, homes lost, children raised by grandparents or the state. Emergency rooms in South Central, particularly at Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital, a facility that would later become so overwhelmed by the volume and severity of drug and violence-related trauma that its emergency department drew comparisons to a combat zone, with military medics reportedly rotating through for trauma training, absorbed the sharp end of a public health emergency that most of the country hadn't yet noticed or hadn't yet cared to. Alongside addiction came violence. Crack's low unit price and high profit margin made street corner distribution an intensely competitive business. And the same gang structures that had been hardening through the late 70s and early 80s now found, in crack, a genuinely lucrative reason to fight over territory. Turf disputes that might once have been settled with fists or, at worst, occasional gunfire escalated in both frequency and lethality as the stakes. A corner that could generate real income climbed. Violent crime rates in South Central rose sharply to the back half of the 1980s, a trend inseparable from the crack trade's expansion, even if, as later government reviews would point out, Ross and Blandon's specific operation was only one part of a much larger, multi-source surge in cocaine supply hitting Los Angeles and other American cities during this period. Ross, for his part, has never claimed he was blind to any of this in real time, but has been candid, in later interviews, that the scale of the damage only fully registered for him gradually, years into running the business, by which point the operation had momentum of its own. Demand for the product didn't ebb because the community was suffering. If anything, addiction drove demand higher, and in the cold logic of the business Ross had built, a business built, ultimately, on maximizing volume and market share, rising demand looked, in the moment, indistinguishable from opportunity. It's one of the darker, more uncomfortable through lines of Ross's story. The same forces devastating South Central were, for a period of years, making him one of the wealthiest young black men in America. That wealth was not going unnoticed, not by his community, not by rival dealers, and increasingly not by law enforcement. By January 1987, with crack markets exploding not just in Los Angeles but in cities across the country, local and federal authorities had zeroed in on Ross specifically as one of the central figures driving Southern California's crack supply. Police organized a dedicated task force explicitly built around taking him down, reportedly nicknamed informally the Freeway Rick Task Force, a name that speaks to how thoroughly Ross's operation and his nickname had become synonymous with the crack trade in the eyes of Los Angeles law enforcement by the middle of the decade. Rather than shut down in response, Ross did something that revealed just how far his ambitions and his organizational thinking had grown. He expanded outward. With pressure mounting in Los Angeles, Ross relocated for a period to Cincinnati, Ohio, along with a girlfriend who had family in the area and who was, according to Ross's own account, struggling with a crack addiction of her own, a detail that underscores in miniature the same contradiction running through his entire career. A man growing his empire, while the drug at its center was actively devastating people in his own life. In Cincinnati, according to Ross's account, Blandón visited him a few months after his relocation and offered him a cut of 13 kilograms of cocaine that needed distributing. Ross took the deal and, using the same playbook that had built his Los Angeles network, reliable supply, disciplined sub-distribution, aggressive market entry, effectively monopolized what had, until then, been a virgin crack market in Cincinnati. From there his reach extended further still, into Cleveland, Dayton, Indianapolis, and St. Louis, turning what had begun as a Los Angeles street-level operation into something closer to a regional, multi-state distribution network. But the expansion that had once seemed to prove Ross's resilience, his ability to route around pressure by simply building a bigger operation elsewhere, was, in retrospect, also the beginning of his exposure. A wider footprint meant more shipments, more couriers, more opportunities for something to go wrong. And in 1988, something did. One of Ross's cocaine loads, moving through a bus station in New Mexico, was flagged by a drug-sniffing dog. It was, in the grand scheme of an operation moving tons of product across the country, a small, almost mundane failure, the kind of routine interdiction that happens constantly in the drug trade, usually without taking down anyone significant. But federal drug agents were eventually able to trace that particular seizure back to Ross's network, and became the first serious crack in an empire that had, until that point, seemed almost untouchable. Ross pleaded guilty to crack trafficking charges connected to the case and in 1990 began serving a mandatory 10-year federal prison sentence. The first time the empire he had spent nearly a decade building came face-to-face with the full weight of the American criminal justice system. It would not be the last. To understand what was actually happening beneath the surface of Ricky Ross's supply chain, beneath the kilograms, the cash, the expanding territory, it's necessary to step back from South Central Los Angeles entirely and look at a conflict unfolding 3,000 miles away in a small Central American country most Americans in the 1980s could not have found on a map, Nicaragua. In 1979, a leftist guerrilla movement known as the Sandinistas overthrew the decades-long Somoza family dictatorship that had ruled Nicaragua with U.S. backing for generations. The Sandinista government that took power was avowedly socialist, aligned to varying degrees with Cuba and, more distantly, the Soviet Union, and to the Reagan administration, which took office in early 1981 amid a broader, aggressive Cold War posture toward any perceived leftist government in the Western Hemisphere. The Sandinistas represented an unacceptable foothold for Soviet-aligned influence in America's own backyard. The response was the Contras, a loose coalition of anti-Sandinista rebel groups, many of them drawing former members of the old Somoza regime's National Guard into their ranks, that the Reagan administration began covertly funding, training, and arming through the CIA almost from the moment it took office. Over the course of the 1980s, U.S. support for the Contras would become one of the most consequential and most controversial covert operations of the entire Cold War, eventually spilling into public view through the Iran-Contra affair, in which senior Reagan administration officials were revealed to have illegally funneled proceeds from secret arms sales to Iran toward funding the Contras, circumventing an explicit congressional ban on direct U.S. funding for the rebel movement. That congressional ban, passed and repassed in various forms throughout the mid-1980s as the Boland Amendments, restricting or at times entirely prohibiting direct U.S. government assistance to the Contras, is critical context for understanding why the money trail alleged in Ross's story matters so much. When Congress cut off official funding, the Contras and their American backers didn't simply stop fighting. They looked for alternative sources of money. Private donors, foreign governments sympathetic to the anti-communist cause. And, according to a body of evidence that would take years to fully surface, individuals within the Nicaraguan exile community who had access to something far more lucrative than any of those options, the cocaine trade. This is where Norwin Menezes and Danilo Blandón re-enter the story, not simply as Ricky Ross's cocaine suppliers, but as men whose earliest ventures into large-scale drug trafficking were explicitly framed, at least at the outset, as fundraising for the Contra cause. According to later Justice Department findings, Contra military leader Colonel Enrique Bermudez had, around 1982, met with both Blandón and Menezes in Honduras, a meeting during which, according to Blandon's own testimony to federal investigators, Bermudez acknowledged the Contras' fundraising difficulties and told the two men that the ends justify the means when it came to supporting the movement financially. Blandón has said he believed Bermudez did not know specifically that he and Menezes were involved in drug trafficking, though Bermudez was reportedly aware of Menezes' broader reputation within the Nicaraguan exile community as someone with organized crime connections. Notably, that particular claim could never be independently verified or refuted by investigators, because Bermudez was murdered in Managua in 1991, years before the controversy over these allegations fully erupted. What's clear and corroborated across multiple independent government investigations is this. Menezes and Blandón were, from the early 1980s, both active in the cocaine trade and both connected to Contra support networks operating in the United States. What remains far more contested, and would go on to become the single most explosive, most disputed claim in the entire story, is exactly how much of the money generated by that cocaine trade actually made its way into Contra coffers, how systematic that funding relationship was, and, most consequentially, how much the CIA itself knew about it and failed to act on. That question wouldn't fully explode into public consciousness until 1996, when a journalist named Gary Webb, whose story we'll return to in full later in this documentary, published an investigative series alleging that profits from the Blandón-Menezes cocaine pipeline had directly funded the CIA-backed Contra war, and that the resulting flood of cheap cocaine into South Central Los Angeles, distributed in large part through Ricky Ross's network, had been a primary catalyst for crack, epidemic that devastated black urban communities across America. It was an explosive claim, and it triggered an explosive response, not just from the CIA, which strenuously denied any organizational involvement in or knowledge of drug trafficking for Contra funding purposes, but from several of the country's largest and most influential newspapers, which mounted an aggressive, sustained campaign to discredit Webb's reporting. In fairness to that later chapter of the story, and we will get there, it's worth stating clearly here what the subsequent government investigations actually found, because the full picture is more complicated and less tidy than either Webb's harshest critics or his staunchest defenders have tended to present it. A CIA Inspector General review, led by Fredericks and released in 2 volumes in 1998, found no evidence that the CIA as an organization or CIA employees specifically had conspired with or assisted Contra-connected individuals in drug trafficking to raise funds for the Contras or for any other purpose. The report also found no evidence that the CIA had hindered or otherwise intervened in the investigation, arrest, prosecution, or sentencing of Ross, Blandón, or Menezes, directly contradicting some of the more sweeping claims that had circulated in the wake of Webb's series about active CIA protection of the trafficking network. But that same CIA Inspector General review, and this is the part that gets far less attention than the initial denial, also acknowledged something significant, that the CIA had, in numerous documented instances, been aware of drug trafficking allegations involving individuals connected to the Contra support network, and had not acted swiftly or consistently to cut ties with those individuals or resolve the allegations. Inspector General Hitz himself put it plainly in testimony to Congress, stating that there were instances where the CIA did not, in an expeditious or consistent fashion, cut off relationships with individuals supporting the Contra program who were alleged to have engaged in drug trafficking or take action to resolve those allegations. A separate, parallel Justice Department Inspector General investigation, spanning more than 400 pages and 15 months of review, reached broadly similar conclusions. No evidence of CIA or DOJ conspiracy to fund the Contras through cocaine sales, but documented failures of guidance, of oversight, of urgency in how the government handled credible drug trafficking allegations against individuals tied to the Contra movement throughout the 1980s. In other words, the full-scale conspiracy some read into Webb's reporting, a CIA that deliberately orchestrated cocaine sales into black neighborhoods to fund a covert war, was not substantiated by any government review, including the ones prompted specifically by his allegations. But the underlying reality Webb was pointing toward, that people connected to the Contra movement were trafficking cocaine into the United States on a meaningful scale, that some of that money likely did support Contra operations, and that U.S. government agencies knew about credible trafficking allegations involving Contra-linked figures and failed repeatedly to meaningfully act on that knowledge, was, in its broad strokes, confirmed by the government's own internal investigators. That distinction between the CIA orchestrated this and the CIA knew and didn't stop it would become the fault line on which Gary Webb's career and eventually his life would come apart. We'll return to that story and to Webb himself in detail later in this documentary. For now, what matters is the pipeline itself. A supply chain that began, at least in part, as Contra fundraising, evolved into personal profit-driven trafficking by men like Blandón and fed directly, kilogram by kilogram, into the operation Ricky Ross was building on the streets of South Central Los Angeles. By the mid-1980s, that pipeline was running at a scale few people outside of it fully understood. Blandon's Colombian supply connections, the same connections that gave Ross access to genuinely wholesale-level cocaine pricing, had, according to Mercury News' later characterization, made Blandón something like the Johnny Appleseed of crack in California, a direct connect between the Colombian cartels and the street-level Crip and Blood networks moving product through South Central. Later government review would push back on the idea that Ross and Blandón were singularly or even primarily responsible for broader national crack epidemic, pointing out that other South Central dealers were independently establishing their own Colombian supply connections around the same time, with or without Blandon's help, and that crack spread across dozens of American cities in the mid-1980s had multiple, largely independent points of origin, not one central pipeline. But within Los Angeles specifically, and within the particular corridor of South Central that Ross's network dominated, the Blandón connection was, without question, central. The single supply relationship that had taken Ross from a small-time dealer to the undisputed king of one of the largest crack markets in the country. And underneath all of it, whether the money genuinely reached Contra fighters in the mountains of Nicaragua in significant volume or whether, as Blandón broke from Menezes in 1983 to sell for his own profit, that original fundraising rationale had become mostly a memory. Underneath all of it sat an uncomfortable, historically documented truth. A foreign policy fight being waged in Washington and Central America had, through channels the U.S. government was at minimum slow to investigate and act. Times appears to have simply looked past, become entangled with a drug pipeline flowing directly into one of the poorest, most heavily policed black neighborhoods in America. Ricky Ross, at the center of that pipeline's distribution end, had no visibility into any of this larger picture in the moment. He was, by his own account, focused on the mechanics of his own business, supply, distribution, expansion, survival. The geopolitics of Nicaragua's civil war were, to him, a rumor at best. What he knew was that Blandón always seemed a product at a price that worked no matter how much Ross's operation grew. Whether that supply chain's roots in Contra fundraising meant Ross's own criminal enterprise had, indirectly, become a financial artery for a U.S.-backed war effort 3,000 miles from his neighborhood. That was a question Ross wouldn't fully confront until years later, sitting in a federal prison, when a persistent investigative reporter reached out to tell him something about his own supply that Ross had never known. For now, in the mid-1980s, the pipeline was simply flowing, and flowing at a scale that was about to carry Ricky Ross to the absolute peak of his power, wealth, and visibility, right before it all began, slowly and then very suddenly, to collapse. By 1985 and into 1986, Ricky Ross's operation had reached a scale that, in retrospect, is almost difficult to comprehend. Federal prosecutors would later estimate his total lifetime cocaine exports at several tons, distributed to buyers across multiple states, generating an estimated $600 million or more over the course of his career. A figure Ross himself has, at various points, described as an underestimate, claiming his organization's peak daily revenue ran as high as $2 to $3 million. Even taking the more conservative government estimates at face value, Ross had built, from nothing, one of the largest individual drug trafficking operations in American history. An empire assembled by a man in his early to mid-20s who, just a few years earlier, had been a functionally illiterate high school dropout with no formal training in business, logistics, or finance. The wealth that flowed from that operation reshaped Ross's daily life almost entirely. Cash, in an all-cash business operating largely outside any legitimate financial system, became less a form of currency than a raw material to be managed, hidden, and reinvested. Ross has described acquiring real estate across Los Angeles and beyond. Properties bought with drug proceeds, both as a way to launder illicit cash into legitimate-looking assets, and as a genuine hedge against the inherent instability of an illegal business that could, at any moment, be seized, raided, or simply disrupted by a rival or a snitch. He drove the cars, wore the clothes, and inhabited the lifestyle that would later become the visual shorthand for 1980s drug kingpin excess in countless films and television dramatizations. Dramatizations that, whether their creators fully acknowledged it or not, were often drawing directly, if loosely, on the outline of Ross's own life. But the paradox sitting at the center of Ross's rise never fully went away, and by the mid-1980s, it had become starker than ever. The same crack economy that had made Ross one of the wealthiest young black men in America was, block by block, hollowing out the very community that had produced him. South Central Los Angeles by 1986 was a neighborhood in visible crisis. Visible, at least, to anyone actually living there, even at the broader American public, and its media apparatus were only beginning to take notice. Emergency rooms, as previously noted, were absorbing a wave of trauma and addiction-related cases that outpaced anything the hospital system had modeled for. Family structures were fracturing under the weight of addiction at a scale that would leave demographic scars still measurable decades later. And violence, driven by the same fierce competition over immensely profitable street corner territory that made men like Ross rich, was climbing toward levels that would, within a few years, make certain pockets of Los Angeles among the most dangerous urban environments in the entire country. It was around this period, in the mid to late 1980s, that the American media and political establishment finally began to fully register what had, for years, been unfolding largely unremarked in neighborhoods like South Central. The language used to describe it, the crack epidemic, would become one of the defining media narratives of the decade, saturating television news, magazine covers, and congressional hearing rooms with images and rhetoric that framed crack cocaine as an almost apocalyptic threat to American cities. Some of that coverage was, by any honest measure, warranted. The public health and social crisis unfolding in neighborhoods like South Central was real, severe, and worthy of serious national attention. But a significant amount of that coverage was also shaped by racial and class-based assumptions about who used the drug and why. Coverage that tended to treat crack as an inherently more dangerous, more criminal substance than its pharmacologically near-identical cousin, powder cocaine, largely because of who was associated with using and selling each version of the drug. That distinction hardened into federal law with the passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, a sweeping piece of legislation passed by Congress in direct response to the growing public panic over crack, a panic significantly amplified by the death, that same year, of college basketball star Len Bias, who died of a cocaine overdose that was widely and inaccurately attributed to crack use specifically, even though a subsequent investigation determined he had used powder cocaine that night. Regardless, the law that emerged from that political moment established what will become one of the most consequential and most criticized sentencing disparities in modern American criminal justice history. A 100-to-1 ratio between the quantities of crack versus powder cocaine required to trigger identical mandatory minimum federal prison sentences. Under the new law, possessing just 5 grams of crack cocaine, an amount that could fit in a small plastic bag, triggered the same mandatory 5-year minimum sentence as possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine, roughly a full pound. The practical and deeply racialized effect of that disparity would unfold over the following decades, because crack was disproportionately sold and used within black communities, while powder cocaine remained more associated with wealthier, disproportionately white users and dealers. The sentencing gap translated directly into a dramatically disproportionate rate of incarceration for black defendants, even when the underlying conduct, cocaine trafficking, was functionally identical between the two forms of the drug. By 1989, roughly 1 in 4 African American men between the ages of 20 and 29 were, at any given moment, either incarcerated on probation or on parole, a statistic that would climb even further into the 1990s, and one that Ross himself, though he did not yet know it, was on a direct collision course with. This was the environment of exploding individual wealth existing alongside exploding communal devastation, of a media narrative finally catching up to crisis years after it had taken root, of the legal system quietly constructing the machinery that would eventually be used to lock up an entire generation of young black men at rates that dwarfed the sentences typically handed down for equivalent quantities of powder cocaine, in which Ricky Ross's empire reached its absolute zenith. And it was against that same backdrop that the first real cracks in the operation's security began to appear. The Freeway Rick Task Force, assembled specifically to bring Ross down, was by 1987 actively working to identify, surveil, and dismantle his network piece by piece. Associates were beginning to draw law enforcement attention. Ross's relocation to Cincinnati and subsequent expansion into new markets, which had once looked like the shrewd maneuver of a businessman routing around localized pressure, had also multiplied the number of moving parts, couriers, subdealers, shipments that could, at any point, go wrong. Something was about to go wrong, and when it did, it would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose not just Ricky Ross's operation, but a far larger, far more consequential network of informants, federal deals, and quietly overlooked drug trafficking allegations sitting just beneath the surface of the entire interconnected pipeline that had made Ross's empire possible in the first place. The net, slowly at first, and then all at once, was beginning to close. The New Mexico bus station seizure that led to Ross's 1990 guilty plea and 10-year federal sentence was, in hindsight, the first domino in a much longer collapse, but it was far from the last. It wasn't even close to the end of Ross's story. What followed over the next several years was a slow, grinding unraveling, not just of Ross's own operation, but the entire supply network that made his rise possible in the first place, a network that, piece by piece, was being pulled apart from multiple directions at once, by rival law enforcement task forces, by informants trading information for their own freedom, and, most consequentially, by the arrest and eventual cooperation of the very man who had built Ross's empire alongside him. Danilo Blandon's own reckoning with federal law enforcement had been building for years by the time it finally arrived. DEA files show that agents and confidential sources had been feeding information about Blandon's trafficking activities into the system as early as 1983, with additional reporting flowing in through 1985 and 1986, including one source who told the San Francisco DEA office that Blandon had traveled to Miami in December 1982 for a Contra support conference, where he was reported to have met with other Nicaraguans believed to be involved in cocaine trafficking. For years, this information seems to have been treated largely as background intelligence rather than as the basis for an active investigation. The DEA did not formally open a case against Blandon until August 1986, when a confidential informant walked into the agency's Riverside, California office and laid out details of Blandon's organization directly to a DEA special agent. That case moved quickly once it started. In October 1986, police raided the Los Angeles home of Danilo Blandón. According to one account relayed by a DEA informant, Blandón had, at the time, roughly $150,000 in cash sitting unnoticed in a safe at the bottom of his own swimming pool, though Blandón himself would later dispute that particular detail to Justice Department investigators. Whatever precise sum, the raid marked the beginning of the end of Blandon's run as an independent trafficker. He was eventually arrested and, in 1992, formally prosecuted by federal authorities. According to later reporting, Blandón admitted to crimes serious enough that, under normal sentencing guidelines, would have sent most offenders away for the rest of their lives. Instead, Blandón served 28 months. That number, 28 months, for a man who by his own admission had spent close to a decade running large-scale cocaine trafficking operations tied, at least in their origins, to a foreign civil war, became one of the central, enduring symbols of everything that felt wrong about how the American justice system handled this entire saga. According to a letter from Assistant U.S. Attorney L.J. O'Neill, later disclosed to Ross's defense team, the government had initially recommended a life sentence and a $4 million fine for Blandón before negotiating that recommendation down, first to 48 months, and ultimately to the 28 months he actually served, with no fine at all. After his release, rather than facing further prosecution or deportation proceedings, despite his cooperation being tied to his ongoing immigration status. Blandón was hired by the DEA as a paid, full-time informant, ultimately receiving more than $166,000 in government compensation for his work. The man who had once taught Ricky Ross how to move cocaine at scale was now, quite literally, on the federal government's payroll, tasked, among other things, with helping build cases against other traffickers, including, eventually, Ross himself. This is a point in the story where the mechanics of what happened to Ross started to feel less like an accident of bad luck, and more like the closing move in a much longer game. Ross had been released from his 10-year federal sentence relatively early, having served a portion of that time before returning to the outside world. And, according to multiple accounts, he was, by the mid-1990s, trying at least in part to stay away from the kind of large-scale dealing that had defined his earlier career, chastened by a decade that had already cost him a significant stretch of his freedom. It was in this period that Blandón, now working for the DEA, but still, from Ross's perspective, simply an old friend and business associate, reportedly reached back out with an opportunity. A substantial quantity of cocaine, hundreds of kilograms, that needed a buyer. Ross has said he did not want to be directly involved in the transaction himself. His account is that he intended to broker the deal, connecting Blandón with another buyer he knew, and step back from the actual exchange, a role that, in his mind, kept him at arm's length from the riskiest part of the operation. But the arrangement itself carried warning signs Ross, by his own later admission, chose to override. Blandón, who had built his reputation over the years doing business at night, wanted this meeting to happen during the day. He wanted it to take place not in Los Angeles, where Ross knew the terrain and controlled his own environment, but in San Diego, in unfamiliar territory. And he wanted payment structured differently than their usual arrangement, with money up front, a departure from how the two men had typically done business together. Ross went anyway. On March 4th, 1995, Ross, along with associates Leroy Brown, Curtis James, and Michael McLaurin, the man Ross is credited as the person who first introduced him to crack cocaine years earlier, was indicted in federal court in San Diego on cocaine conspiracy and distribution charges. The government simultaneously filed formal notice of its intent to seek a mandatory life sentence against Ross, based on 2 prior drug convictions already on his record. What followed was, in retrospect, one of the more surreal moments of the entire saga. On February 15, 1996, the prosecutor in the case, Assistant U.S. Attorney O'Neill, formally informed Ross's defense counsel, Alan Fenster, of the identity of the government's confidential informant in the case. It was Danilo Blandón, the same man who had spent over a decade as Ross's supplier, mentor, and, by Ross's own description, something close to family. O'Neill's disclosure letter to the defense laid out Blandon's own criminal history in detail, including the fact that, prior to his own 1992 arrest, Blandón had spent years as a large-scale cocaine broker himself. It also detailed the benefits Blandón had received from the government in exchange for his cooperation, not just a reduced sentence and the ongoing DEA salary, but specific payments tied directly to the Ross case, $500 in February 1995, $2,000 in March, another $1,000 that same month, $2,000 in April, and finally a $40,000 reward payment in May 1995, once his information had helped produce Ross's arrest. The trial itself ran from March 5th through March 19th, 1996. Blandón took the stand as the government's principal witness, testify about the history of his relationship with Ross, his own early involvement with Norwood Menezes in his account, an account he had also given separately to Justice Department investigators, that he had begun dealing drugs in 1982 alongside Menezes, with most of the resulting profits going to support the Contras, keeping only enough for himself to cover expenses. It was, in open federal court, an official government witness testifying, under oath, as part of the case the Justice Department itself had built, that his own drug trafficking career had originated, at least in part, as fundraising for a covert U.S.-backed war effort. And notably, when Ross's defense attempted to press further into the specifics of Blandon's connection to the CIA and the broader Contra funding question during the trial, the Justice Department moved to block that line of inquiry. On November 21st, 1996, the district court formally ruled on a legal question that would later prove enormously consequential. whether Ross's 2 prior drug convictions, one in Texas, one in Ohio, should be counted as 2 separate strikes under federal sentencing law, or whether they should have been treated as a single underlying conspiracy. The court ruled they were, in fact, 2 distinct prior convictions. Given that ruling, and given his conviction in the San Diego case for conspiring to purchase more than 100 kilograms of cocaine from a federal informant, the court found itself legally required to impose a mandatory sentence, life in prison, with no possibility of parole. Ricky Danilo Ross, the tennis prodigy turned crack kingpin, the man whose network had, at its peak, moved tons of cocaine and generated hundreds of millions of dollars, the man whose entire criminal career had been built on a supply chain originating with Nicaraguan exile who had, by his own sworn testimony, once funneled drug profits toward a CIA-backed guerrilla war, was, at 36 years old, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison cell. The man who had made that outcome possible, whose testimony had provided the government's central evidence, whose decade of trafficking had, according to his own account under oath, originated as Contra fundraising, walked out of that same courtroom a free man, having already served his 28 months, still collecting a government paycheck as a DA informant. It is difficult to overstate how thoroughly this asymmetry, Ross's life sentence set against Blandon's 28 months and ongoing government employment, would come to symbolize, for critics of the entire episode, everything that felt broken about how the war on drugs had actually been prosecuted in America. An entire generation of black street-level dealers and distributors absorbing mandatory life sentences under the 100 to 1 crack sentencing regime, while the foreign national wholesale, suppliers who had helped ignite the epidemic in the first place, suppliers whose own trafficking careers were tangled up with a covert U.S. foreign policy operation, walked away with a fraction of the punishment, sometimes literally on the government's payroll. Ross, sitting in a federal prison awaiting the formal reality of a life sentence, had no idea that the specific chain of events that had put him there, the CIA, the Contras, Blandon's original fundraising arrangement with Menezes, the whole Barrett architecture beneath his own criminal career, was, at that very moment, in the process of being uncovered by a single investigative journalist working out a mid-sized California newspaper. Ross wouldn't learn the full outline of that story from a fellow inmate or a lawyer or a news broadcast piped into the prison. He would learn it, according to his own later account, directly from the reporter himself, a man named Gary Webb, who was about to publish an investigation that would connect Ross's downfall to a scandal reaching all the way to Washington, and who would, in the process, pay a price for that reporting that arguably exceeded even what happened to Ross. Gary Stephen Webb was born on August 31st, 1955, in Corona, California, the son of a Marine sergeant whose career took the family through a series of relocations during Webb's childhood. He built his journalism career the traditional way, working his way up through newspapers in Kentucky and Ohio through the early 1980s, earning a reputation as a diligent, aggressive investigative reporter with a particular talent for digging into stories that other journalists either missed or avoided. By the time he was hired by the San Jose Mercury News, Webb had already established himself as a serious investigative talent. He contributed to the paper's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and over the following years built a track record covering everything from freeway retrofitting failures to problems in California state computer systems. The unglamorous, detail-heavy investigative work that rarely makes headlines on its own, but establishes a reporter's credibility for the moment when a much bigger story comes along. For Webb, that moment arrived through a chain of circumstance that began, by several accounts, with a court case involving cocaine forfeiture assets and a defense attorney who tipped Webb off to a much larger story hiding underneath the specifics of that individual case, a story about the origins of the cocaine that fueled the crack epidemic in Los Angeles, and about a supplier, Danilo Blandón, whose connections ran back to the Nicaraguan Contras. Webb spent well over a year investigating, digging through court records, DEA files, immigration documents, and, notably, corresponding directly with Ricky Ross himself, who was by then sitting in federal prison. According to accounts of their interaction, it was Webb who first informed Ross of the full scope of Blandon's Contra connections. Information that Ross, despite having done business with Blandón for over a decade, had never fully understood himself. In August 1996, the San Jose Mercury News published Webb's investigation under the title Dark Alliance. the story behind the crack explosion, a three-part series running roughly 20,000 words in total. Its opening line set the tone for everything that followed, describing how, for the better part of a decade, a San Francisco Bay Area drug ring had sold tons of cocaine to the Crips and Blood street gangs of Los Angeles, funneling millions of dollars in drug profits to a Latin American guerrilla army run by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. Language that framed the story not just as a drug trafficking expose, but as a direct indictment of U.S. intelligence complicity in the crack epidemic's devastation of black urban America. The series named names, Ross, Blandón, Menezes, and traced in granular detail the supply chain connecting a Nicaraguan exile fundraising network to South Central Los Angeles' street-level crack economy. It arrived at a moment when the Mercury News was, notably, one of the earliest major American newspapers to have a fully developed web presence, and the story spread with a speed and intensity that surprised even Webb and his editors. At the height of public interest, the web version of the series was reportedly drawing 1.3 million hits a day, an extraordinary figure for a mid-1990s news website. The series sparked protests and intense anger within black communities across the country, many of whom felt it confirmed long-standing suspicions that the crack epidemic devastating their neighborhoods had not been an organic accident, but something the government had known about and allowed to happen while it served other strategic purposes. It also triggered congressional hearings and, eventually, the two parallel Inspector General investigations from the CIA and the Justice Department, whose findings we've already examined. It's worth being precise here, because precision is exactly what got lost in the ensuing firestorm. Webb never claimed in the original series that the CIA had directly ordered or organized drug sales to fund the Contras. His own account of the story's core claim, given later in a 1997 interview, was narrower than how it was often characterized in the public reaction and subsequent media coverage. He described his goal as documenting where the cocaine was actually being sold, primarily in the inner cities of Los Angeles, an effect it had in helping spark what he described as a crack epidemic that spread from Los Angeles to hundreds of cities across the country. But the series is framing its title, its opening lines, its overall narrative architecture, undeniably invited a reading that went further than that narrower claim, that the CIA had, at minimum, turned a blind eye to a trafficking operation it knew was fueling a domestic addiction crisis, in service of a foreign policy goal it considered more important. The backlash, when it came, was ferocious, and it came not primarily from the government, but from Webb's own peers in the journalism industry. Over the months following publication, three of the country's most influential newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times, each published lengthy pieces scrutinizing and, in large part, disputing key elements of Webb's reporting. Critics focus on specific claims within the series that they argue were overstated or insufficiently supported. The characterization of Blandón and Ross as singularly responsible for igniting the national crack epidemic, rather than one significant node among several independent supply chains developing simultaneously in different cities. The suggestion of direct, knowing CIA complicity, which went beyond what Webb's own sourcing could definitively establish, and questions about how tightly the drug profits in question were actually tied to Contra funding versus Blandon's personal enrichment once he broke from Menezes in 1983. Some of that scrutiny was legitimate journalism doing its job, testing an explosive story's claims against the available evidence, as any serious investigation should. But critics and defenders of Webb alike have noted, in the years since, that the scale and intensity of the counter-coverage was unusual, that rarely had the nation's most powerful newspapers devoted quite so much combined institutional resource and attention to dismantling a single investigative series from a comparatively smaller regional paper. Under mounting internal and external pressure, the San Jose Mercury News itself began to back away from Webb's reporting. The paper's own editor eventually published a note acknowledging shortcomings in the series' framing and evidentiary support, a highly unusual public retreat from a paper's own major investigative work. Webb was reassigned from his investigative beat to a much smaller bureau in Cupertino, a demotion in every functional sense, and the paper conducted an internal review of his methods and sourcing. For Webb personally, the professional consequences were severe and lasting. He resigned from the Mercury News in December 1997, roughly a year and a half after the series' publication, effectively ending his career as a mainstream daily newspaper journalist. Despite a resume that included a Pulitzer Prize-winning contribution and years of well-regarded investigative work prior to Dark Alliance, Webb found himself, in the aftermath, largely unemployable within the industry that had once celebrated him, treated, as one later retrospective piece described it, as radioactive within mainstream journalism. He continued working on smaller freelance projects and expanded his original series into a book, also titled Dark Alliance, published in 1998, which allowed him to lay out his full reporting and sourcing at greater length than the original newspaper format had permitted. He continued speaking publicly about the story, about government transparency, and about what he saw as the media establishment's role in bearing a legitimate, if imperfectly framed, investigation. But professionally and financially, by every account, Webb never recovered. Friends and family later described a man whose confidence and stability had been fundamentally shaken by an experience that had cost him not just his career, but, in a very real sense, his professional identity, a veteran investigative reporter who had spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation for careful, credible work, suddenly finding that reputation treated as permanently compromised, regardless of what later evidence might show. On December 10, 2004, 7 years to the day after his resignation from the Mercury News, Gary Webb was found dead in his home in Carmichael, California, from 2.38 caliber gunshot wounds to the head. The Sacramento County Coroner's Office ruled his death a suicide, a finding his family has said they accept. Reporting on his final days, drawing on interviews with his family, painted a picture of a man whose long-time struggle with depression had been compounded, in his final weeks, by a series of personal setbacks, including, reportedly, the theft of a motorcycle that his mother later described as feeling to him like a final straw amid a broader accumulation of pressures. He left behind several letters, including one to his mother, and according to family accounts had been keeping a firearm by his bedside for more than a year before his death. His family has stated their belief that while Webb's death stemmed in part from his own long-standing depression, the sustained professional backlash and isolation following Dark Alliance played a significant and lasting role in his decline. One relative was quoted at the time saying that if the newspaper industry had stood behind him, there was no doubt in her mind he would still be alive. Webb reportedly left behind a note stating, simply, that he never regretted anything he had written. The manner of Webb's death, 2 gunshot wounds, an unusual detail that some commentators and conspiracy-minded observers have pointed to over the years as evidence of foul play rather than suicide, has fueled ongoing speculation and alternative theories about what actually happened to him, some of it from serious researchers and some of it from considerably less credible sources. It is important, in telling the story honestly, to be clear about where the actual evidence sits. The official investigation in the Sacramento County Coroner's Office both concluded suicide, a conclusion Webb's own family has publicly accepted, even while continuing to hold the newspaper industry morally responsible for the pressures that led him there. This documentary will not speculate beyond what has been officially established and what Webb's own family has stated on the record. What happened in the years after Webb's death, however, adds a final, crucial layer of complexity to his story, because in a slow, grinding reversal that Webb himself never lived to see, significant portions of his original reporting began receiving a far more sympathetic reassessment from within the very journalism establishment that had once worked so hard to discredit him. Both the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune would, in later retrospective pieces, defend core elements of the original Dark Alliance series, arguing that the aggressive rebuttal campaign mounted by major papers in 1996 and 1997 had focused disproportionately on legitimate weaknesses in some of Webb's specific claims, while largely failing to meaningfully re-engage with, or in some cases actively obscuring, the broader and ultimately far more consequential questions his reporting had raised about CIA awareness of contra-connected drug trafficking, about the government's own documented failures to act on credible allegations against individuals in that network, and about how directly those failures may have contributed to the specific supply chain that helped fuel the crack epidemic in South Central Los Angeles. The 2014 film Kill the Messenger, starring Jeremy Renner as Webb, brought renewed public attention to his story and his eventual, posthumous partial vindication, a bitter irony that was not lost on those who had followed his career. That Hollywood found Gary Webb's story dramatically and morally compelling roughly a decade after the journalism industry had effectively destroyed his career, and roughly a decade after his death. For Ricky Ross, sitting in federal prison serving what was at the time still officially a life sentence, Gary Webb's reporting represented something more immediate and more personal than a media controversy playing out in newspaper opinion pages. It was Webb, through his correspondence and reporting, who gave Ross his first real understanding of the larger architecture underneath his own criminal career. The fact that the man who had taught him the business, who had supplied him for over a decade, whose testimony had ultimately helped put him away for life, had begun his own trafficking career, by his own sworn account, as fundraising for a covert war effort that the United States government itself had authorized and directed. That knowledge didn't get Ross out of prison. But the years that followed, years Ross would spend not simply serving his sentence, but transforming himself in a federal prison library, teaching himself to read for the first time in his adult life, and building, book by book, the legal knowledge that would eventually give him a path back to freedom, would become, in their own way, just as improbable and just as central to the larger story as anything that had come before. To understand exactly what kind of sentence Ricky Ross received in 1996, it helps to understand the broader legal and political machinery that produced it. Machinery that had been under construction for years before Ross ever set foot in that San Diego courtroom. The idea of dramatically escalating punishment for repeat offenders. The conceptual root of what would eventually be marketed to voters as 3 strikes and you're out, actually has roots stretching back nearly a century in American sentencing law. Though the modern political movement that produced the law Ross was sentenced under emerged specifically out of the early 1990s. California had, in fact, maintained some version of a habitual criminal statute on its books since the 1920s. But the law that would determine Ross's fate was a distinctly 1990s creation, born out of a wave of public fear and political urgency following 2 horrific, high-profile murders. The 1992 killing of 18-year-old Kimber Reynolds and, even more prominently in the national consciousness, the 1993 kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas by a man with a long history of prior felony convictions. Both cases became rallying points for a tough-on-crime political movement that, by 1994, had gathered enough momentum to push California's 3 strikes law through both the state legislature and, redundantly, a statewide ballot initiative, Proposition 184, that voters approved by an overwhelming margin. The law that resulted was, by design, extraordinarily rigid. A first strike doubled the sentence for any subsequent felony conviction. A second strike triggered a mandatory minimum of 25 years to life. And critically, this was a detail that generated the most enduring controversy around the law in the years that followed. A third strike, under California's original 1994 statute, did not need to be a serious or violent offense to trigger a mandatory life sentence. Any new felony conviction, however minor, could serve as a trigger, provided the defendant already carried 2 prior convictions defined as serious or violent under the state's penal code. This was the version of the law that would go on to produce some of the most widely criticized sentencing outcomes of the era, including, most famously, a 25 years to life sentence handed down to a man named Jerry Dwayne Williams for stealing a slice of pizza from a group of children on the Redondo Beach Pier, a case that would later become a kind of shorthand symbol for everything critics believed had gone wrong with the law's design. Ross's case moved through a parallel but related track, the federal system's own version of enhanced sentencing for repeat drug offenders, incorporating similar habitual offender logic through federal mandatory minimum statutes and the federal 3 strikes provision that Congress had folded into the sweeping 1994 federal crime bill, a law that, notably, had been shepherded through the Senate in part by then-Senator Joe Biden and signed by President Clinton. Under this framework, Ross's 2 prior drug trafficking convictions, the Texas case and the Ohio case tied to his early 1980s trafficking activity, and the New Mexico-linked federal case from 1990, were treated by the sentencing court as sufficient grounds to trigger a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole once he was convicted in the 1996 San Diego case. The court's specific ruling on November 21, 1996, that his Texas and Ohio convictions constituted 2 separate, distinct prior offenses rather than a single underlying conspiracy, was a legal hinge on which his entire sentence turned. Had the court found the opposite, Treating those two convictions as one continuous offense rather than two, Ross would have entered the San Diego case with only a single prior strike, changing the entire sentencing calculus that followed. That distinction, separate convictions versus a single underlying conspiracy, might sound like a technical legal footnote. It would, in fact, turn out to be the single most consequential legal detail of Ross's entire life, though neither Ross nor his defense team fully grasped the significance in 1996. It would take years and an almost unimaginable personal transformation on Ross's part before that detail resurfaced as the foundation of his eventual freedom. Ross entered federal prison in 1996 carrying, for all practical legal purposes, a permanent sentence, a man in his mid-30s being told, in no uncertain terms, that he would die behind bars. By his own later account, and by the accounts of journalists and biographers who later chronicled this period of his life, Ross spent the early stretch of his incarceration processing the sheer scale of what had happened to him. The empire he'd spent nearly 2 decades building, the hundreds of millions of dollars that had passed through his hands, all of it gone, replaced by a cell and a number. What happened next is, by any honest measure, one of the more remarkable personal transformations documented in the recent history of American mass incarceration. Not because it is unique in kind. Prison systems across the country hold countless people who have similarly transformed themselves through education, self-discipline, and sheer determination, most of them without the media attention Ross would eventually receive, but because of the specific, almost novelistic irony at its center. A man whose entire path into crime had been set in motion at 17 years old by his inability to read, spent his prison years teaching himself, from scratch, in his late 20s, to do exactly that. Ross has described the process candidly in interviews over the years. He began, gradually and with real difficulty, working through books in the prison library, starting by several accounts, with material aimed at building basic reading comprehension before moving into more substantive territory. Self-help books, business and entrepreneurship titles, and increasingly legal texts. Over the course of his incarceration, Ross would go on to read something in the neighborhood of 300 books, an extraordinary figure for anyone, let alone a man who had entered prison functionally illiterate. He has said, with a mixture of pride and something closer to regret, that he believes he may have peaked intellectually and even athletically during his incarceration, noting, in one interview, that a chance discovery of a tennis court at the federal facility where he was held allowed him to rediscover the sport that had first been taken from him by the same illiteracy he was now, finally, overcoming. He has said he believes he became a better tennis player during his prison years than he had ever been as a teenager on the courts of South Central. A small, strange, almost poetic detail buried inside a much larger story of loss and reinvention. But it was the law of books, more than anything else, that would ultimately determine the rest of Ross's life. Immersing himself in the mechanics of federal sentencing law, criminal procedure, and appellate practice, Ross began methodically studying the specifics of his own case, a process that, by his own account, took years of sustained effort, conducted largely without the benefit of formal legal training, in the margins of a life otherwise defined by the grinding routine of a maximum security federal facility. What he eventually found, buried in the technical architecture of how his prior convictions had been classified, was a detail that would set him free. The argument that his Texas and Ohio convictions, rather than constituting two genuinely separate criminal episodes, had in fact originated from a single underlying drug conspiracy that had simply been prosecuted, somewhat arbitrarily, in 2 different jurisdictions. If that argument held, then under a correct application of the sentencing framework, Ross should have entered his 1996 case with only 1 prior strike rather than 2, a distinction that would have made the mandatory life sentence legally improper. It was, by all accounts, an argument his own defense attorneys had been skeptical of when Ross first raised it. But Ross pursued it anyway, building his case through the appellate process with the same discipline and refusal to accept a closed door that had, in an earlier chapter of his life, driven him from a South Central tennis court into one of the largest drug empires in American history. This time, that same discipline was aimed at getting himself out of a cage rather than building one for the neighborhood he came from. His case was eventually brought before a federal court of appeals, which agreed with the argument Ross had spent years constructing, that the 3 strikes framework had been erroneously applied in his original sentencing, and that his prior conviction should not have been treated as 2 separate strikes. The court ordered him resentenced. Where Ross had once faced a legally mandated sentence of life without parole, his sentence was reduced to 20 years. He was released from the Federal Correctional Institution in Texarkana, Texas, on September 29, 2009, a 50-year-old man walking back out into a world that had changed almost unrecognizably from the one he'd left behind in 1996. He had entered federal custody at the peak of a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He walked out with, by multiple accounts, essentially nothing. His properties long since seized by the government, his cash gone, his name itself, quite literally, no longer entirely his own, having been appropriated in his absence by a Miami-based rapper who had built an entire recording career under the name Rick Ross, while the real Rick Ross sat in a federal prison cell unable to do anything about it. The years immediately following his release were, by Ross's own account and by the accounts of journalists who covered his re-entry into society, genuinely difficult. A period during which he reportedly moved between living out his car and staying with his mother while he attempted to translate the connections, discipline, and reputation he built over decades of criminal enterprise into something legitimate. It is worth pausing on this detail, because it complicates any tidy narrative of triumph or redemption. Ross did not walk out of prison into a waiting fortune or a guaranteed platform. He walked out broke, into a media and legal landscape that had, in his absence, already begun repurposing his own story for entertainment, for controversy, for other people's profit without him. His first major legal fight after release was, notably, not against the government or against any of the institutions that had prosecuted him, but against the rapper who had taken his name. Ross filed suit against William Leonard Roberts II, the Miami-based artist performing as Rick Ross, in 2010, alleging that Roberts had misappropriated his name and identity to build his own music career while Ross was incarcerated and unable to object. The legal battle stretched across roughly 3 years, moving between federal and California state courts, before ultimately being resolved in the rapper's favor on First Amendment grounds. Courts finding that Roberts' use of name, however directly it may have drawn on the real Ross's notoriety, constituted protected artistic expression rather than unlawful identity theft. It was, for Ross, a bitter outcome, one more instance, in a life already full of them, of watching someone else profit from the raw material of his own biography, while he was left to absorb the legal and financial costs of trying to reclaim it. But Ross did not remain frozen by that setback. Over the years that followed, he methodically rebuilt a public identity around the very things that had once been taken from him: literacy, education, and legitimate entrepreneurship. He began speaking publicly, at schools, at colleges, on podcasts, at community events, about his own story, framing it explicitly as a cautionary tale about the intersection of poverty, limited opportunity, and the criminal justice system's often disproportionate response to the people caught up in that intersection. In 2014, working with journalist and author Kathy Scott, he published Freeway Rick Ross, the untold autobiography, an unsparing account of his life that did not shy away from the more difficult and morally complicated parts of his own history, including, notably, an account of an incident of domestic violence in which Ross admitted to having kicked a pregnant girlfriend down a flight of stairs, causing a miscarriage. A detail the book includes as part of its broader, unsentimental accounting of the human cost of the life he had built. The book received largely positive critical attention and was nominated for a full review Indie Fab Award in the true crime category. He appeared in the 2015 documentary Freeway, Crack in the System, which received an Emmy nomination and further cemented his public role as a first-hand narrator of the crack era rather than simply a subject discussed by others. He became a recurring guest on major podcasts, including multiple appearances on The Joe Rogan Experience, where his detailed, matter-of-fact recounting of his own criminal career, alongside his equally detailed critique of the sentencing disparities and government failures that had shaped his prosecution, reached a new, much younger, largely non-black audience who had likely never encountered his story through the 1990s news coverage that had originally made him notorious. And in the years since, Ross has moved into a business he has described as both a genuine passion and a kind of ironic full-circle moment: legal cannabis. Beginning roughly 7 years before his more recent public statements about the venture, Ross entered the legal marijuana industry, eventually launching his own cannabis brand, LA Kingpins, a name that leans directly, unapologetically, into his own notorious history rather than running from it. He has spoken about the venture not simply as a business opportunity, but as a form of advocacy, working with organizations focused on creating pathways for black entrepreneurs into an industry that, in a detail Ross himself has pointed to repeatedly and pointedly, now generates enormous legal profits selling a product whose prohibition once helped fuel the very war on drugs that sent him to prison for life. He has also worked on efforts to help people with criminal records pursue expungement, framing that work as a direct extension of his own hard-won understanding of how thoroughly a criminal record can foreclose legitimate opportunity even decades after a sentence has been served. The core insight underlying Ross's entire post-prison public life, repeated across dozens of interviews, his memoir, his advocacy work, is a version of the same argument that runs through the darker, more geopolitically tangled portions of the story. That his own rise and fall cannot be fully understood as simply the story of one bad actor making bad choices, but has to be understood within the context of an educational system that failed him before he ever sold a single gram of cocaine, a sentencing regime that treated crack cocaine, disproportionately sold and used in black communities, with dramatically greater severity than the pharmacologically similar powder cocaine favored by wealthier, whiter buyers and dealers, and a supply chain whose origins, whether Ross fully understood at the time or not, trace back to a covert foreign war that the United States government itself had authorized, funded, and then, according to its own internal investigators, failed to adequately police once credible evidence of drug trafficking within that network began surfacing. None of that recontextualization erases the very real damage Ross's operation did to the community he came from, the addiction, the violence, the families torn apart by a product he spent years distributing at an industrial scale, often while fully aware by his own admission of what it was doing to the people buying it. Ross himself has never fully disowned that part of the reckoning. His memoir and his public statements have, at various points, acknowledged the harm directly rather than deflecting from it entirely. But the fuller picture, Ross is a literacy-driven exclusion from a legitimate path, the deliberate architecture of the crack versus powder sentencing disparity, the 28 months served by the supplier who set him up compared to the life sentence handed to Ross himself, and the buried contrafunding origins of his own supply chain, complicates any simple story of individual criminal culpability into something closer to what it actually was. One especially visible, consequential node inside a much larger, much more institutionally implicated system. That system, and Ricky Ross's improbable path through the middle of it, was about to become the raw material for one of the most acclaimed crime dramas of the streaming television era, a show that would introduce Ross's story, in fictionalized form, to millions of viewers who had likely never heard his real name. In 2017, FX premiered a crime drama titled Snowfall, created by filmmaker John Singleton, the South Central-raised director whose 1991 film Boys and the Hood had, a generation earlier, already established him as one of the defining cinematic chroniclers of the neighborhood's struggles with gang violence, poverty, and the crack epidemic, alongside co-creators Eric Amadio and Dave Andron. The show followed a young South Central drug dealer named Franklin Saint, played by British actor Damson Idris, as he rose from small-scale marijuana distribution under his uncle's guidance to become one of the dominant crack cocaine suppliers in 1980s Los Angeles, a rise that, mirroring the real history this documentary has spent the last several acts detailing, becomes entangled with a CIA operative character, Theodore Teddy McDonald, who supplies Franklin with cocaine in exchange for funding directed toward the anti-Sandinista war in Nicaragua. The parallels to Ricky Ross's real story are, on their face, difficult to miss. So difficult, in fact, that the show's connection to Ross became one of the most persistent talking points surrounding the series throughout its 6-season run. Both stories follow a young, ambitious South Central dealer whose rise is inseparable from a supply chain connected to Contra-linked CIA-adjacent financing. Both dramatize the same historical moment, the same geography, the same collision between a local street-level drug economy and a covert foreign war being waged thousands of miles away. But Singleton and his fellow creators were consistent, across years of interviews, in describing Franklin Saint not as a direct biographical stand-in for Ross, but as what showrunner Leonard Chong and later showrunner Walter Mosley and Dave Andron himself repeatedly characterized as a composite figure, assembled from multiple real individuals who lived through this exact era of South Central's drug economy. In interviews conducted during the show's run, Singleton spoke about drawing on what he described as a rich, largely undocumented oral history and folklore surrounding the era. Stories passed down to the neighborhood itself, from people who had actually lived through the period, rather than drawing his narrative exclusively from any single documented biography. Executive producer Thembi Banks and other members of the creative team have, in separate interviews, specifically named the real-world figures whose stories fed into Franklin Saint's character beyond Ross alone. Michael Harry O'Harris, the South Central trafficker who would later become a consultant and early financial backer behind the founding of Death Row Records, the label that would go on to launch the careers of Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac Shakur, and who served 28 years. In prison on charges including crack dealing, kidnapping, and attempted murder before receiving clemency, Brian Waterhead Bo Bennett, a South Central native convicted alongside a high-ranking Cali cartel connection of operating a continuing criminal enterprise involving nearly 1,000 kilograms of cocaine, and Thomas Tootie Reese, another figure from the same era's drug economy, whose story has been referenced by the show's creative team as part of the broader composite that shaped Franklin's arc. The show's creators have also pointed to specific, deliberate divergences from Ross's actual biography as evidence that Franklin Saint was never intended as a strict one-to-one portrait. Unlike Ross, who entered the drug trade only after his illiteracy foreclosed his path toward a tennis scholarship, Franklin Saint is depicted from the show's earliest episodes as an avid, intellectually engaged reader, arguably the single most direct inversion of Ross's actual formative struggle. And where Ross's story ends in redemption, a self-taught reader, an appellate legal victory, eventual release and reinvention as an author and entrepreneur, the show's ending for Franklin Saint, without spoiling specifics for viewers who haven't reached the finale, charts a considerably darker, more nihilistic final trajectory, one that several critics writing about the show's conclusion described as closer to an American tragedy than a redemption arc. For Ricky Ross himself, none of this careful creative team framing has landed as a satisfying explanation. Ross has been consistent and, at times, pointed in public statements asserting that he sees Franklin Saint as a direct dramatization of his own life story, one built, in his telling, without his direct involvement, consent, or compensation. In multiple interviews given during and after the show's run, Ross has described an earlier working relationship with John Singleton specifically, claiming the two had been in the process of developing a film project based directly on Ross's own life before that collaboration, in Ross's account, quietly fell apart, an ending Ross has described with evident bitterness, as Singleton simply disappearing from the project, only for Snowfall to emerge sometime later as what Ross characterizes as an unauthorized, uncompensated use of the same underlying story. They stole my life story, Ross said flatly in one interview conducted years into the show's run, describing the situation as, in his words, a fact rather than a grievance open to interpretation. He has noted publicly, including in extended conversations on the Joe Rogan Experience, that he was not paid for the use of what he considers his own biography, framing it as one more instance, following the earlier legal battle over his own name with the Miami rapper, of other people profiting from the raw material of his life while he received nothing. It's worth holding both of these truths in view simultaneously, because they are not actually contradictory, even though they sit in obvious tension with one another. Snowfall's creative team has consistently and specifically described Franklin Saint as an amalgamation of several real South Central figures rather than a direct Ross biopic, a claim supported by genuine, documented divergences between characters' arc and Ross's actual life. And Ricky Ross has, with equal consistency, experienced the show as a direct, recognizable, and uncompensated dramatization of his own specific story, a perception grounded in the undeniable structural and historical overlap between Franklin's arc and Ross's own well-documented biography, an overlap far more extensive than the show's creator's description of a loose composite might, on its surface, suggest to someone unfamiliar with the underlying history. This tension between the television industry's legal and creative right to draw inspiration from real historical events without direct compensation to every person whose life might have informed a character, and a real person's legitimate grievance at watching a widely celebrated, critically acclaimed television series built substantially on the outline of their own biography, without their direct involvement or financial participation, is not unique to Ross's situation. It echoes in a different register similar disputes that have surrounded numerous other based on a true story and inspired by real events dramatizations across film and television history. But it carries particular weight in Ross's case precisely because of how directly his own story, poverty, illiteracy, a foreclosed path to legitimate success, an entanglement with covert foreign policy that neither Ross nor virtually anyone else fully understood until a journalist's investigation years later connected the dots, mirrors almost exactly the central narrative architecture the show's writers built their entire six-season arc around. Zooming out from the specific dispute over credit and compensation, the larger reason this story, Ross's real biography, Snowfall's fictionalized version of it, and everything in between, continues to resonate nearly 4 decades after it began, is that it sits at the intersection of several distinct threads in American history that rarely get examined together with this level of connective detail. A sentencing policy regime embodied first in the crack versus powder cocaine disparity and later in mechanisms like California's 3 strikes law and its federal counterpart that disproportionately and severely punish black defendants for offenses that, when committed by wealthier and disproportionately white offenders using powder cocaine, drew dramatically lighter sentences. A foreign policy chapter, the Reagan administration's covert war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua that involved documented instances of the U.S. government's own intelligence apparatus, knowing about credible drug trafficking allegations connected to the very network it was relying on to prosecute that war and failing, according to its own internal watchdogs, to adequately act on that knowledge. And a media accountability story, embodied in Gary Webb's Rise, Fall, and posthumous Partial Vindication, that raises still unresolved questions about how the country's most powerful news institutions handled a story that, however imperfectly framed and reported in some of its specific details, was pointing toward a real and serious set of institutional failures that deserve sustained, rather than reflexively dismissive, scrutiny. Ricky Ross sits, whether he ever intended to or not, at the literal center of all 3 of those threads. He is simultaneously the cautionary tale about individual criminal enterprise of the just say no era want to tell about the crack epidemic, and a living rebuttal to the idea that individual criminal enterprise is ever really the whole story. A man whose own rise was shaped at every major turn by institutional failures that had nothing to do with his individual moral choices. An educational system that let a talented teenager slip through functionally illiterate, a sentencing regime constructed with a 100 to 1 disparity that has never been fully or convincingly explained on anything other than racial grounds, and a covert foreign policy operation whose own government's watchdogs later confirmed had, at minimum, looked the other way on credible trafficking allegations involving the very people who built Ross's supply chain. Snowfall, for all the specific disputes over credit and compensation that Ross has raised, did something genuinely significant in bringing this fuller, more complicated version of the story to a mainstream television audience largely unfamiliar with any of it. It's easy to forget, watching a critically acclaimed 6-season FX drama with a devoted fan base, just how buried and contested this history actually was for decades, how thoroughly the journalism establishment worked to discredit Gary Webb's original reporting on it, how little mainstream attention the CIA and Justice Department's own internal investigations received relative to the scale of what they actually found, and how completely Ricky Ross's name had faded from broad public consciousness by the time the show premiered in 2017, more than 2 decades after his original arrest and conviction. Whatever the disputes over exactly how much of Franklin Saint's story belongs to Ricky Ross specifically versus the broader composite of South Central figures the show's creators have described, Snowfall's existence and its considerable critical and popular success reflect something genuinely true and important, that the story of this documentary has spent the last several acts reconstructing piece by piece, from court records, government reports, and Ross's own testimony, is not some marginal footnote to the crack epidemic's history. It is arguably one of the central, defining narratives of that entire era, a story about a boy who lost a tennis scholarship to literacy, a Nicaraguan exile whose drug trafficking career began as fundraising for a covert war, a journalist who paid with his career and possibly his life for trying to connect those 2 threads, and a criminal justice system that handed one of those men a life sentence while paying the other a government salary. Before returning to where this story began, to that parking lot in San Diego, and to what actually happened in the moments the cold open only hinted at, it's worth taking stock of what became of the other central figures in this story, because their fates, set side by side, tell you almost everything you need to know about how unevenly the consequences of this entire episode were actually distributed. Danilo Blandón, the man whose testimony sent Ricky Ross to prison for life, never served meaningful time for the trafficking career he himself admitted to under oath. His 1992 arrest, which prosecutors initially argued warranted a sentence off the charts, a recommendation that specifically floated life imprisonment alongside a $4 million fine, ultimately resulted in 28 months behind bars. He was released, retained his legal permanent resident status in the United States despite his criminal history, and was placed directly onto federal government's payroll as a paid DEA informant, a role for which he collected more than $166,000 over the following years, including the specific payments tied to building the case against Ross himself. By the time Gary Webb series was preparing for publication in 1996, Immigration and Naturalization Service officials were reportedly moving to rescind Blandon's legal permanent resident status, a bureaucratic footnote that arrived years after his cooperation had already secured him his freedom and his government paycheck, and years after the damage his supply chain had done to South Central Los Angeles was already history. Norwin Menezes, the larger, more senior trafficker whom Blandón had originally worked under and who had, by his own later counts of government investigators, been the one to frame the earliest cocaine sales explicitly as contra fundraising, met a different fate, though arguably no more proportionate. After years of eluding serious American prosecution, protected in part by a pattern of shifting jurisdictions and by his own attempt to work as an informant even as multiple DEA and FBI offices were simultaneously investigating him, Menezes was finally arrested by Nicaraguan National Police in Managua in November 1991, in a sting connected to a $15 million drug smuggling case. He was convicted in Nicaragua in August 1992 and sentenced to 25 years in prison, later reduced to roughly 12.5 years, before ultimately being released from Nicaraguan custody in November 1997, having served a fraction of even that reduced sentence. When Justice Department investigators interviewed Menezes in a Nicaraguan prison in April 1997 as part of their broader review of the Dark Alliance allegations, he reportedly denied ever having been a drug trafficker at all, despite extensive documentation to the contrary in DEA files, and claimed he had simply been set up on the Nicaraguan charges. Investigators noted that his political connections within Nicaragua appear to have provided him a degree of protection from more serious prosecution for years. And Gary Webb, the journalist who connected all of these threads, who spent well over a year building an investigation that, however imperfectly framed in some of its specific claims, pointed to a real and serious pattern of governmental knowledge and institutional failure, paid the highest price of anyone in this story who wasn't the one actually moving cocaine. He lost his career. He lost, by every account from people close to him, a significant measure of his own sense of professional identity and purpose. And on December 10, 2004, he was found dead in his Carmichael home, 2 gunshot wounds to the head, a death the coroner ruled a suicide, and that his own family has said they accept, while continuing to hold the newspaper industry's treatment of him at least partly responsible for the decade of professional isolation that preceded it. Set those 4 outcomes side by side, and the moral architecture of this entire story comes into sharp, uncomfortable focus. The man who moved the drugs at the retail level, who built the visible, prosecutable empire on South Central street corners, Ricky Ross, received a mandatory life sentence, eventually reduced through his own extraordinary self-directed legal education to 20 years, of which he served roughly 14. The men who supplied him, whose own trafficking careers began, by their own sworn testimony, as fundraising for a U.S.-backed covert war, Blandón and Menezes, served 28 months and roughly 6 years respectively, with Blandón additionally collecting a government salary for his cooperation, and the journalist whose investigation connected the entire chain together, who arguably did more than anyone else in the story to force a public reckoning, however incomplete and contested, with how that chain had been allowed to function, lost his livelihood, his professional reputation, and ultimately his life. There is no tidy moral lesson to extract from that distribution of consequences. It simply is what it is, a record of who paid and how much and for what, set against a case that involved, by the U.S. government's own internal investigators, credible drug trafficking allegations connected to a covert war effort that senior American officials knew about, at least in fragments, and did not move urgently to address. It would be incomplete to close this story without acknowledging what happened in the years after Ross's conviction, to the specific sentencing regime that had produced his original life sentence in the first place. Because in the 2 decades that followed, that regime underwent significant, if partial and still contested, reform, driven substantially by the same racial disparities this documentary has traced throughout Ross's own case. In 2010, Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation that directly addressed the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine that had defined federal drug prosecution since the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. The same disparity that had shaped the entire architecture of punishment surrounding the crack epidemic Ross's operation had helped fuel. The 2010 law reduced that ratio from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1, a meaningful, if still imperfect, narrowing of a gap that had never been convincingly justified on any grounds other than the pharmacologically nearly identical drugs' differing association with race and class. It did not eliminate the disparity entirely, and critics have continued to argue, in the years since, that even an 18-to-1 ratio lacks any coherent scientific or public safety justification. But it represented the first significant legislative acknowledgement at the federal level that the sentencing framework built around crack cocaine specifically, the same framework under which Ricky Ross had originally been sentenced to life without parole, had produced outcomes that Congress itself, by 2010, was prepared to formally recognize as disproportionate. California's own 3 strikes law underwent a parallel, if separately motivated, reform 2 years later. In November 2012, California voters approved Proposition 36, substantially narrowing the state's original 1994 framework by requiring that a third strike itself be classified as a serious or violent felony in order to trigger the mandatory 25 years to life sentence, closing a loophole that had, for nearly 2 decades, allowed comparatively minor, nonviolent third offenses like Jerry Dwayne Williams' pizza theft to result in life sentences. The reform came after nearly 2 decades of mounting evidence about the law's actual practical effects. Prison populations that had swelled dramatically since 1994, state corrections costs that had climbed into the billions of dollars annually, and a sentencing pattern that, by the time reform finally passed, saw more than half of all inmates serving 3-strike sentences incarcerated for crimes the law's original 1994 advocates had never specifically had in mind when they promised voters the law would keep murderers, rapists, and child molesters behind bars, where they belong. Ross's own case, of course, was resolved years before either of these reforms arrived. Resolved not through legislative change, but through his own painstaking, self-taught legal argument about how his prior convictions had been improperly counted. But the broader reform movement that followed his sentencing represents, in its own institutional, slow-moving way, a kind of vindication of the argument Ross's own life has embodied from the very beginning, that the sentencing architecture built around the crack epidemic and around habitual offender statutes more broadly had drifted by the mid-1990s into territory that even mainstream American political consensus would eventually come to recognize as excessive, poorly calibrated, and racially disproportionate in its real-world application. The reassessment of Gary Webb's original reporting followed a similarly slow, similarly incomplete arc, one that, unlike the sentencing reforms, arrived too late to do Webb himself any good, but that nonetheless represented a meaningful, if belated, institutional acknowledgement of how badly the initial response to his work had misjudged the underlying story. In the years and decades following his death, a series of retrospective pieces from major outlets, including some of the very papers that led the original 1996 and 1997 campaign to discredit his work, revisited the Dark Alliance controversy with considerably more sympathy toward Webb's underlying findings, even while continuing to acknowledge legitimate weaknesses in some of the series' more sweeping specific claims. The core distinction that emerged from this reassessment mirrors a distinction this documentary has tried to draw throughout: Webb's most explosive-sounding framing. A CIA that had knowingly, deliberately used cocaine trafficking to fund the Contras was never fully substantiated by any government investigation, including the ones his own reporting directly triggered. But his underlying thesis, that individuals connected to the Contra movement were engaged in serious drug trafficking, that some meaningful portion of that trafficking's profits likely did support Contra operations at least in the movement's earlier years, and that the CIA and other federal agencies had documented knowledge of credible trafficking allegations involving Contra-connected individuals and failed, for years, to act on that knowledge with any urgency, was, in its broad outline, confirmed by the government's own internal watchdogs. That the initial media response treated Webb's reporting as almost entirely discredited, rather than as a flawed but substantially directionally accurate piece of investigative journalism that had identified a real and serious institutional failure, remains one of the more uncomfortable case studies in recent American journalism history. A reminder that institutional skepticism, even when partly justified by genuine weaknesses in a specific reporter's sourcing or framing, can curdle into something closer to reflexive dismissal when the underlying story threatens sufficiently powerful institutions. The 2014 film Kill the Messenger brought Webb's story back into mainstream cultural conversation nearly a decade after his death, introducing his career and its consequences to an audience that had, in many cases, never heard his name, a form of posthumous recognition that, however well-intentioned, could do nothing to restore the career or the life that the original backlash had cost him. Let's go back now to where this whole story began, to that San Diego parking lot in March 1995, to a man sitting in his car, sensing that something was wrong, and going ahead with the meeting anyway, knowing everything we now know about Blandon's decade-long relationship with the DEA that had begun forming years earlier, about the specific, itemized payments he received for building the case against Ross, about the 28 months he had already served for his own admitted trafficking before walking free onto government parole. That parking lot moment reads very differently than it would have to Ross himself. In the actual instant it was happening, Ross went into that meeting believing he was dealing with a man he had known for over a decade, a man he has described in his own words as having become something close to family, a man who had taught him nearly everything he knew about the wholesale cocaine trade, and who had, by extension, been one of the central architects of Ross's entire adult life. For better and ultimately for very much worse, Ross had no way of knowing, walking into that daylight meeting in unfamiliar territory, that the man across from him had already made his peace with the government years earlier, that the entire structure of the encounter, the unusual timing, the unfamiliar location, the money demanded up front, was not simply Blandon behaving oddly, but Blandon executing a transaction that had already been scripted in outline by federal prosecutors and DEA case agents who had spent months building toward exactly this moment. The tragic irony embedded in that scene is almost too clean for fiction, which may be part why Snowfall's writers, whatever precise composite ratio of Ross's biography to other real figure stories, clearly recognized its dramatic power and built an entire 6-season arc around variations of the same basic betrayal architecture. A young man built up by an older mentor figure whose own motives and allegiances run deeper and darker than the young man ever fully understands, until the moment that mentor's true position is finally catastrophically revealed. But this wasn't fiction. Ricky Ross really did spend a decade of his life believing Danilo Blandón was, whatever else he was, someone Ross could trust. And Danilo Blandón really did. When the moment came for him to choose between protecting that relationship and protecting his own freedom, choose his own freedom, collecting a $40,000 reward payment in the process, on top of everything else the government had already given him. Strip away the individual names, and what's left is a story about 3 separate American institutions: public education, criminal sentencing, and covert foreign policy, each failing, in its own distinct way, to reckon honestly with the consequences of its own design, and all 3 of those failures converging, almost accidentally, in the biography of one South Central teenager who simply wanted, more than anything, a way out of poverty that didn't require him to compromise himself. The public education failure is the quietest of the 3, but arguably the most foundational. A school system that moved Ricky Ross through a decade of instruction without ever adequately addressing his literacy, that let a genuinely talented athlete reach his senior year of high school before anyone with the authority to intervene registered that he could not read at a level sufficient to access the exact opportunity. A tennis scholarship that the system itself had spent years implicitly promising him was achievable if he simply kept working hard enough and winning enough matches. There is no single villain in that failure. It is the kind of quiet, structural, distributed failure that rarely makes headlines on its own because it doesn't have a dramatic shape of scandal. It just has the slow, compounding shape of a kid falling through cracks that a better resource, better designed system would have caught him in years earlier. The sentencing failure is louder and more directly attributable, a federal and state legal apparatus that constructed to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and its accompanying 100-to-1 sentencing disparity, and later through California's original 1994 three strikes law and its federal counterpart, a punishment regime that treated the drug disproportionately sold and used within black communities with severity that bore no honest relationship to its actual pharmacological difference from the drug favored by wealthier, whiter buyers, and that treated repeat offenses with a rigidity severe enough to sentence men like Ross to death in custody for offenses that, under a differently calibrated framework, the very framework California and the federal government would each eventually adopt, years too late to help Ross directly, would never have carried anything close to a life sentence. And the foreign policy failure is the one this story is ultimately named for, the one that gives it stranger, more geopolitically improbable shape. A covert war, waged largely outside meaningful congressional oversight for years at a stretch, financed in part through channels that included by the sworn testimony of the men who ran them, cocaine trafficking profits, and a CIA that, according to its own internal inspector general, was aware of credible drug trafficking allegations involving individuals connected to that war effort and did not, in a consistent or expeditious fashion, act on that knowledge. None of these three failures on their own fully explains what happened to Ricky Ross, or to South Central Los Angeles, or to the tens of thousands of families across the country whose lives were reshaped by the crack epidemic of the 1980s. But together, layered one on top of the other, they explain something that a simpler story, one poor kid's bad choices, full stop, never adequately could. How an entire generation of South Central Los Angeles, disproportionately black, disproportionately poor, ended up absorbing the human cost of the drug epidemic whose supply chain traced back, however circuitously, to a foreign policy decision made in Washington, D.C. by people who never set foot in the neighborhood and who were never held meaningfully accountable for what their own government's watchdogs later confirmed they had known and failed to act on. Ricky Ross has spent the years since his 2009 release trying, in his own way, to tell exactly this fuller version of the story. Not to excuse the very real harm his own operation did to his own community, which he has, at various points, acknowledged directly, but to insist that the story be told completely rather than in the simplified, individual culpability-only version that dominated the initial media coverage of his case in the 1980s and 90s. Snowfall, whatever the specific disputes over credit and compensation that continue to sit between Ross and the show's creators, brought a fictionalized version of that fuller story to millions of viewers who would otherwise likely never have encountered any of it. Gary Webb, working alone, against fierce institutional resistance and at ultimately catastrophic personal cost, was the first person to actually connect all of these threads together in print years before Snowfall existed, years before Ross's own memoir, years before the CIA's own internal investigators confirmed the broad outline of what he had found. He didn't get everything right, but he was, in the ways that mattered most, telling the truth. And it took the institutions built to hold power accountable, the CIA, the Justice Department, and, most painfully, his own profession, the better part of 2 decades to admit it, by which point the man who had done that work was no longer alive to hear it. So that's the full arc. From a poor kid on a tennis court in South Central who lost a shot at a scholarship because no one ever taught him to read, all the way through a covert war in Nicaragua, a journalist who paid with his career and his life, and a life sentence that a self-taught prison library scholar eventually read his own way out of. That parking lot arrest you saw in the first 30 seconds of this video. Now you know everything that led up to it and everything that came after. If this kept you here till the end, do me a favor. Hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with somebody who needs to see how deep this rabbit hole actually goes. Most people have heard of Snowfall. Way fewer people know the real story underneath it. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Ricky Ross's story was really the direct blueprint for Franklin Saint? Or do you think it's something bigger than any one person's life? A story about an entire system that this country still hasn't fully reckoned with? Drop your take below. Thanks for watching all the way through. I'll see you in the next one.